Hi, I'm Josh Rushing, standing in for Lisa Fletcher today, and you are in the stream. Who decides when states fail? We examine the annual Failed States Index. As always, our digital producer, Malika Bilal, is here looking out for your live feedback. Hey, Malika, I know there's been a lot of talk about this on my Twitter page and Facebook page as well. How's it going for the AJ stream?
Well, for days, there's been a lot of talk about this. And of course, our community is heavily involved and there are strong opinions on both sides. I've got a lot of video comments from around the world with people chiming in on this topic. So for those of you at home, if you'd like to join the conversation, tweet us, use the hashtag AJStream.
Great, thanks, Malika. And next to Malika is JJ Messner, the co-director of the Failed States Index and a senior associate for the Fund for Peace. JJ, thanks for being here today. I appreciate
Thanks,
it. Sure. Here at the stream, we use many social media tools to bring your comments and questions into the conversation. Now, Twitter is one option. Follow us for updates on stories and topics that we're covering. You can do so by logging on to twitter.com/AJStream. Now, here are some of the hashtags we're following. Do failing or failed states pose a danger to international security? That's what many scholars and policymakers seem to agree on, using countries like Somalia, Afghanistan, and Sudan to prove their points. They argue conditions in failing states make ideal environments for terrorist activity. But what and who determines if a state has failed? Each year, the Fund for Peace, or FFP, releases the Failed States Index, a ranking of 177 countries based on their levels of stability and vulnerability. Let me pull up the index on my computer and show you a few examples. It's on the foreign policy page, and it's a map of the world, and you can see most of the red is here in Africa. You got Colombia and South America, and then a lot of the greater Middle East. But if you look at countries involved in the Arab Spring last year, Egypt, you click on it, and below you can see their rank this year is they're 31 from the top. Now, Somalia is actually the first. As a matter of fact, the first 5 countries are all from Africa. And then if you look at another country from the Arab Spring, Libya, it's at 50. Now, both of these countries you can see have actually grown on the failed states list. That is to say that they have become more vulnerable to being a failed state over the years. So it doesn't really, the Failed States Index doesn't really appreciate what happened in the Arab Spring last year, but we're going to get into that more in the conversation. Now, the Fund for Peace says their aim is to objectively assess and score countries using a set of quantitative indicators. It's actually 12 to be exact, and we'll bring those out further in the discussion as well. Now, FFP hopes the index can be used as a policy tool to help governments and NGOs come up with improvements. Critics, however, question the value and the fairness of the index, saying it's flawed in its conception and it should be abandoned because it paints an incomplete picture. So, is the Failed States Index a helpful tool or a misleading initiative? To help us find out, we're joined via Skype from Maputo, Mozambique by Elliot Ross. He's a writer for Africa is a Country blog. Also via Skype from Melbourne, Australia is Syed Muhammad Ali. He's a columnist for the Express Tribune and a PhD candidate at the University of Melbourne. Elliot, Syed, welcome to the stream.
Hi, Josh.
Thanks for being here. I'm going to come back to you in just a second. I'd actually like to begin the conversation with JJ, since he's the originator of the list. Tell us, I think I should begin first with, does the list have a pragmatic purpose? Are there countries or NGOs that have actually used it? Are there examples of that? I mean, it's for more than just discussion, right?
Absolutely. And the Failed States Index, when it was developed 8 years ago, really filled somewhat of a policy and information gap, because people would look at fragile states and try and identify them on really amorphous, unclear standards. But what the failed states index is able to do is actually put a metric to it, actually quantify what susceptibility to failure actually means. And to be clear, for a country to rank on the failed states index, and for a country to even rank at the top of the failed states index, does not in and of itself mean that that country has failed. What we're saying is the country at the top of the failed states index has more pressures upon the country, the state, and is more susceptible to failure. Although that said, I think that for many people, looking at Somalia as an example, which has been our #1 country for 5 years now, that might be the closest that it comes to many people's conceptions of what a failed state might look like.
Now, it's a big media event when the index comes out every year, and it is published by Foreign Policy magazine, and something else they publish with it is called Postcards from Hell. Tell me about that.
Well, Postcards from Hell, in full disclosure, the Postcards from Hell is a feature in foreign policy, and Fund for Peace is not part of that. But I know that there's been a lot of criticism about Postcards from Hell.
Do you understand why people find it insulting for their homes to be called hell?
I absolutely understand the frustration of, first of all, having a country represented by one photo, because it doesn't matter what country you're in, whether you're in a very underdeveloped country or whether you're in a very advanced country, one photo is never going to tell the story. And so that, I think, to begin with, is a source of frustration. But it also demonstrates why, and you mentioned in your lead-in, that the failed states index is based on 12 primary indicators. And the fact that an index like FSI has such a broad spectrum of indicators really underlines the importance of looking at the full picture, looking at the full spectrum. And unfortunately, I think where a lot of people's frustration has come from is that they feel that their country is being represented by just one snapshot, which they don't feel is really representative of their country.
Well, do you find it frustrating? Because, I mean, if you really look at Postcards from Hell, it takes this entire subject and it makes it, at worst, some kind of disaster porn, at best, tabloidish. I mean, to call these countries hell is insulting and unfair. And I know that your organization, Fund for Peace, spends all year putting this index together. You put it out, and then they slap it with 50 pictures from agencies, one picture from each country, and call it Postcards from Hell. Is that frustrating for you? And if so, it's the third year in a row that they've done it. I mean, can you not engage with foreign policy?
Well, no one likes to be told that they're living in hell. I mean, that's just something that people don't want to hear, and I don't think it's very often accurate either. But I think from the point of view of Fund for Peace and anyone who's using the index, I think that it's unfortunate that we get distracted from what the index is actually telling us. That we focus our efforts on a series of images on a website versus what is the failed states index actually telling us? What are the indicators telling us in terms of where the pressures are, what the trends are over time? And really, I think that we should be focusing much more on that.
And JJ, speaking of frustration on the actual list and moving away from Postcards from Hell, there's a tweet here from Numfundo who says, it's hugely problematic, meaning the list, groups too many countries together to capture any complexity at all. It's unnecessarily alarmist, but of course our community is divided. So on the other hand, we have Nafizi on Twitter saying, my opinion is that the failed state ranking is a wake-up call for the government of those countries. Of course, we'll get to more questions throughout the show, but that's just a snapshot. Well,
just as a response to that, though, unnecessarily alarmist. What do you say to that?
Well, I think that it really underlines the importance of looking beyond the rankings and looking beyond the total scores. Again, looking at the trends, looking at the individual indicators and understanding what they mean. Because yes, there can be two countries that are ranked very similar on the index, but it does not mean that they are in any way the same. It just means that the combination of their indicators means that they are at a similar place on the index. And onto the point of the second tweet, I completely agree. And that's one of the core purposes of the failed states index, which is to draw attention to these pressures. Because if you look at conflict, if you look at fragile states, it doesn't need the Fund for Peace to be able to tell you that Somalia is a fragile state. It does not need the Fund for Peace to tell you that Afghanistan is in a state of conflict. But what about other countries that aren't so frequently covered in the mainstream media, like, for example, the Central African Republic or Chad, for example? What we're able to do by ranking those countries, by analysing those pressures, is to bring those countries and the pressures they experience into the global discourse.
I want to bring Elliot into the conversation, but just before we move on, is the title Postcards from Hell defensible? I can't tell if you were defending it or you're talking around it.
I think that we have the same issue with the failed states index in many ways, because we have many people who will say that that failed states index is in and of itself
rather than vulnerable states index.
Exactly is in and of itself offensive or unhelpful.
So are these ideas defensible? The name failed states index, the title Postcards from Hell, is that defensible?
I don't want to get into a discussion on editorial decisions at another organization's website.
I wish you would, though, because you're partnered with them. Hold on, though. I want to bring in Elliot Ross. Elliot, so, you're joining us from Mozambique today. Thank you for joining us at this time.
No, it's all.
And I'm looking at the picture of Mozambique on the Postcards from Hell and Failed States Index. It's a young boy, military hat, standing in front of a burned out vehicle. I don't know if you can see out your window there, Elliot. Is this what Mozambique looks like to you today?
No, it was very peaceful in Maputo today. No sign of fires. The picture that they used is from, I think, 2010 or maybe even 2009.
A couple years ago.
But I mean, we have to separate out what foreign policy do, as your guest was saying, from what it is that
Elliot,
the Fund produce.
Let me lead into your question with this.
Having said that, I do think it's completely disingenuous to completely separate for Mr. Mesner to suggest that he has nothing to do with what foreign policy, the way that foreign policy choose to present this. The only reason that anybody cares about this index or talks about it is because of its presentation in foreign policy, and specifically is the Postcards from Hell.
Hey, Elliot, I want to table Postcards from Hell right now, and I want to hear your broader analysis of what the index says about Africa. Top 5 countries: Somalia, Congo, Sudan, Chad, Zimbabwe. Jump down to 10 through 12: Central African Republic, Ivory Coast, and Guinea. So what is that? 8 out of the top 12 are all African countries. I know you cover Africa for Africa is a Country blog. Tell me, is this assessment accurate?
Well, look, if you want to find out something about these countries, then the last place you should go is the Fund for Peace Failed States Index. This will tell you very little about either the current situation in these countries or about the historical reasons that have the histories that have shaped conditions in these countries. Nobody is realistically saying that these countries don't have problems, but when you set them on a scale, as the Fund for Peace do, it's just, I mean, to me, it's laughable, to be honest, because your guest said that people should look at the methodology for the index, and I would encourage them to do so, because it's transparently a complete waste of time. They throw together just a huge melange of completely unquantifiable factors, and then measure them based mainly on human judgment, in fact. And then there's no publication of the data. They say that there's too much data. Well, too much data for the internet is very much a new thing to hear on my side. I mean, I think this is just a lot of nonsense on stilts, and it has no credibility.
Elliot, I want to let JJ respond, but before I do, I'd like to pull Syed into the conversation here. Syed, you're from Pakistan, correct? Mm-hmm. And Pakistan is number 13 on the list. Does that seem right, fair, or accurate to you?
No, I mean, it doesn't, and it is a bit offensive. I mean, particularly, I mean, if you've traveled beyond Pakistan, been to some of the other countries, it's really like trying to compare apples and oranges. It really reinforces the current stereotypes. It becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. And you see, my basic problem with the failed state index and the discussion we've been having here is this sort of projection and presentation and this aura of neutrality and rationality. Whereas if you look at entities like the Fund for Peace or foreign policy for that matter, you cannot genuinely say that, there's there's an imperative behind them. There's a neoliberal geostrategic imperative behind them. And just to give you two very sort of simple examples, when the current index was launched, I mean, the CIA was there, the head of the CIA was there talking about it. I mean, within the products that the Fund for Peace develops, I mean, you have a human rights and business roundtable. Now, give me a break, I mean, human rights and business. So what's good for business is good for human rights, and
Hey, Syed, let me bring in a video comment from one of our viewers. Hold on, Syed, we're going to come back to you.
Well, Syed, I think our community members are just as skeptical as you are. There's a tweet from James who says, any failed state index that puts Greece as stable and Malaysia as borderline failed has basic systemic issues. Another from Sarah Rashid who says, I'm actually surprised the U.S. didn't rank higher considering the economic decline and Occupy violence. And JJ, I'd like you to listen to this video comment and let me know your comments afterwards.
Foreign policy has issued a report called Postcards from Hell. I just wonder how come the country that is the most indebted in the world and has no natural assets compared to the quote-unquote hellish countries, how come such a country is not featured in the report? How come such a country is called heaven? What exactly defines a failed state? Thank you.
Well, I don't know if the U.S. is calling itself heaven, but the general gist of his question stands.
Well, again, I think that your viewer was referring to the United States, but as anyone who looks at the failed states index would see, the United States is actually quite far from the best end of the index. The most sustainable country, as we define in the failed states index, is Finland, who has been for 2 years straight, and before that, for 5 years, it was Norway. So, first of all, that's not actually the case. But when we talk about state failure, I think it is really important that we do define what we're talking about. Ultimately, when we do talk about state failure, we are talking about where a state is unable to adequately serve and protect its own citizens, where we see a breakdown of the rule of law, extreme poverty and inequality, and a lack of public services, among other things. And we've got to remember, this is not a binary thing. It's not a you're failed or you're not. It's a very broad spectrum. And what the failed states index does is it actually plots out countries on that broad spectrum. But I do want to respond to a couple of things from a couple of points from our colleagues on Skype. Well, first of all, in terms of talking about methodology, the Fund for Peace has a very rigorous methodology. It was developed about 20 years ago, and the failed states index is merely based off that conflict assessment framework. The method of which we use to analyze is a triangulation of content analysis, which is looking at the data to which Elliot refers to. And I'm sorry, Elliot, I'd love to publish copyrighted material that we analyze, but it's not ours.
Transparency on this would be appreciated, I think. You must be one of the very few organizations that thinks it's okay to publish these kinds of things without any kind of data being provided whatsoever. I understand you published the rationale, the framework or something, but people need to see the raw data.
Why can't people see the raw data?
Well, first of all, it's not ours. We analyze millions of documents every year, many of them from various news sources, and it's the copyright in the news sources, and if Elliot knows a better way of getting around copyright, maybe he and I should talk. But really, ultimately, most of the criticisms have been fairly vague in all of this. And although, Elliot, I love the term nonsense on stilts, I want to remember that and I want to use that myself. Love it.
I actually want to go to Syed's criticism of a neoliberal and imperial. And if you look at the map, and I don't know if our viewers can see the map on my computer right now, it seems that any country that is an ally with the U.S. is in some shade of green here. Any country that runs contrary with the U.S. is orange to red. For example, South America, Venezuela, orange. Chile, green. China, Russia, both orange. But all of Western Europe, some shade of green. Australia, New Zealand, Canada, some shade of green. So is it that the criteria you set up somehow like reinforces the idea of a certain notion of governance? I mean, or is this actually a neoliberal imperial agenda that becomes like a self-fulfilling prophecy.
Well, look, we do stand by the dispassionate analysis that we do perform, but you're absolutely right that any framework, whether it be the failed states index or any other framework that you care to mention, is put together by people. And when people put together a framework like that, they're going to come with their common preconceptions and their general worldview. And so in that sense, I absolutely fully accept that the failed states index is based on what some might say is a Western perspective.
So it begins with a Western perspective.
But let's look at what that Western perspective actually is. That Western perspective, as people would describe it, is human rights good, rule of law good, poverty bad, economic inequality bad, responsible security services good. Like I fail to see how many countries would quarrel with that. And though some might describe it as a Western bias, I think that that's actually maybe not such a...
well, Elliot, for a look at the non-Western perspective, there's a member of our community on Twitter, Nobisuthu, who says, don't be silly now. Don't you know failed state is code word for African states that don't do as the West says? Another tweet from Mimi who says, hint, stop using the term failed states. Failed how, for whom, check who uses the definition. Elliot, I'd like you to listen to this video comment, and I'd like your thoughts after.
Hi, my name is Bhumika Gimire, and I'm originally from Nepal, number 27th on the list of failed states. My question is, how is it going to help this debate if the failed countries are termed as hell on earth? Isn't that going to turn this debate into an overly emotional one rather than focusing on the issues and the data? Thank you.
So Elliot, is it just a problem of terminology?
Well, I think she's hit on an important problem there, which is that the problem with the failed states index is that it exists. This is why I say that it's a failed index and the organizations that run and promote it should desist, because what they're doing is framing a discourse in a way that is just hugely unhelpful. The idea that it's useful to compare relative state failure seems to me to be risible. And at the start of your guest's comments, he said something that I thought was revealing, which was that is a country failing, is a state failing? I mean, one problem here is that we simply don't know what they're talking about. Is it the state? Is it the nation state? Is it a nation? Is it a government? Is it a people? Is it a geographical area? What are we talking about here? And if we're talking about the different problems that are being faced by these countries, is the state or the nation state or whatever it is, whatever the unit that's being applied here, is it even a useful way of analyzing a problem? For example, if we're looking at instability caused by climate change, which is obviously a problem that's growing across Africa, I think to analyze that on the level of the nation state and to somehow pretend that there's a level of accountability there for the government
Elliot,
directly is completely misleading.
Elliot, I want to cut you short for a minute. I want to bring Syed back in here. So Syed, I'm looking at headlines out of Pakistan today. There's militants attack a major Pakistan air base, 9 killed. 25 Shia pulled off a bus in Pakistan and killed. Then I'm looking across some of the other countries. Iraq, 22 people, 105 killed, 105 wounded. Afghanistan, nearly 24 wounded in a bombing. Congo, mine collapse, killed 60. Somalia, journalists being killed. You know, all these are red countries. Syed, does JJ have a point here? Could the list be right? I mean, I get that it's offensive, but could it be correct?
Right. Look, Josh, I mean, basically, my problem, again, with this is the absolute lack of non-reflexive, sort of the lack of, absolving oneself and not pulling oneself into the picture. I mean, let me use one of the indicators which was just cited earlier, uneven economic development. One does not doubt 180 million people in Pakistan. There are serious problems right now in Pakistan. I'm not doubting that. But look at, uneven economic development, vengeance-seeking groups, economic decline. Now, don't tell me that all of these things have nothing to do with 9/11. They have nothing to do with Pakistan's involvement.
Okay, Syed, you bring up the point of what's the cause. We want to get to that. We're going to get to that in the post show. Thank you, JJ, Elliot, Syed. This discussion will continue online at stream news.aljazeera.com. On Monday, the team looks at the upswing in attacks on U.S. mosques and why no one seems to be talking about that. Until then, see you online. All right, welcome to the Online Post Show. We're going to pick the discussion up pretty much right where we left off. As a matter of fact, I want to go back to Saeed. And Saeed, you wrote a column about this that was picked up in a number of newspapers around the world. You had an interesting idea that I'd like you to expand on a little bit. I think you were just getting to it at the end of the show there. You brought up the notion of why isn't there a failed foreign policy index? Can you tell us a little bit more about what you meant by that?
Yeah, it's the lack of non-reflexibility. I mean, look at all these criteria, vengeance-seeking groups, economic decline, intervention of external state actors vis-a-vis Pakistan. All of this has happened in the post-9/11 context and our alliance with the US, in the fight against terror. Now, having, this kind of a role for Pakistan and then absolving oneself of the responsibility and ranking it. And what I had said regarding neoliberalism, and this applies to many other countries besides Pakistan, talking about uneven economic development. Now you look at all the literature, emerging out of World Bank, USAID funded experiences that increases inequality. So on the one hand, asking countries to do economic reforms in a certain way which increases the gap between the rich and the poor, and then ranking them on the basis of that and taking oneself out of the picture, is that fair?
Okay, Saeed, I want to go to Elliot and ask, Elliot, if there was a lead into this, a preamble that said, and it's all the West's fault, it's all the U.S.'s fault, would people not be so offended? I mean, I know a number of the people that reached out on my stream at Facebook were pointing to Iraq being number 9, and they're like, wait a second, how does the U.S. get to invade and occupy Iraq for 9 years, turn it into the country it is, and then put it number 9 on the list? Is there something in the preamble that could make this more palatable to you?
One of the problems with discussing world affairs in terms of an index is that it's like a league table, and it encourages questions of blame that are impossible to resolve and turn into thoughtless identitarianism within minutes. I think that to sort of ask somebody, well, there's been a lot of violence in Pakistan, isn't it a failed state? It completely misses the point, and also there's a lot more interesting things to discuss here. We're talking about this index as though it's an inevitable thing, but it's not. I want to return to the questions that you asked at the beginning about the index, which I thought were the most interesting ones. Specifically, who makes this index? Who is it that's deciding, and why? To what end is it that we have to go through this every year? And I would say that the reasons that are given for the index are very vague to help the policy community. Well, who is the policy community? To help governments? Which governments? To do what? I mean, a skeptic would say that the way that state failure is framed has become an increasingly important part in arguments in favor of yet more foreign intervention on the part of the United States. Because if you can frame a situation of state failure in whichever state you're interested in, then it makes it much easier to make the case for humanitarian intervention.
Okay, Elliot, I want to bring JJ back in the conversation here.
We think about what purpose is this serving? Like, what is this really doing in the world to try and say, oh, we can measure state failure? It's an absurd idea, but it's definitely doing interesting things.
JJ?
I'm glad you asked, because there's two ways of looking at the failed states index. Ultimately, what does the failed states index measure? It measures pressure on a state. And there's two ways of looking at it. You can either look at it and say, oh, the Fund for Peace is awful. Who are they? What is this index? Oh, its methodology is terrible. Oh, you don't show us your documents. You don't show us what you analyze. Oh, therefore I'm not going to believe it because I can't see it right in front of me. Or you could actually look, as many countries do, and if anyone has seen the discussions in Indonesia this year, they can actually look at, okay, what is this index telling us? How can we actually use this information proactively? Because we can all sit here in an air-conditioned studio in Washington, or my colleagues in Melbourne, or Elliot, I don't know what your air conditioning is like in Maputo, but you can basically sit in this policy community and argue about ranks and scores till the cows come home.
Wait, I do want to argue about ranks just for a second, specifically about ranks. When you look at the Arab Spring, you see Libya probably moved the furthest up the list. Egypt moved up the list. Another Arab Spring country, Bahrain, that's a very close ally to the U.S., it's where the Fifth Fleet is stationed, only moved up like 4 spots. And yet they're going through their own state of instability in Arab Spring as well. Why is it that a U.S. ally in the Arab Spring seems to suffer less in moving up the list than all the other countries involved?
Well, first of all, for Libya, it was actually ranked around about 100th in the 2011 index, and it, as you rightly pointed out, it shot up the index more than any other country has year on year in the history of the index. And in talking about Bahrain, I think that there's actually a fairly similar situation with Syria, and I'll tell you why. The reason is the time slice that the failed states index uses, because to be an index that can be compared over time, it needs to conform to a time period, a time sample, so January 1st through to December 31st. And as we saw with Syria, for example, most of the conflict, though there was some that happened during 2011, most of the conflict has actually happened after July 1. And so at the risk of using a cliche, watch this space, I would say that in 2013, we're actually likely to see most of those effects in Syria to be reflected in the 2013 index.
Okay, well, we're going to have to look for that then next year. In the meantime, let's go to Malika and look at some other leads that we're following.
Bahraini human rights activist Nabil Rajab has been sentenced to 3 years in prison, and his supporters are furious. Let's be clear, lack of international action over Rajab gave Bahrain the green light to savagely sentence him for protesting, Dominique tweets. Rajab, who appeared on the stream on June 4th, has been in and out of custody since June 6th for a tweet deemed insulting to the royal family. Netizens say the latest sentence for unauthorized protesting is hypocritical. In one hand, the king says he is for reforms and freedom. On the other, he imprisons Nabil Rajab, Angry Arabiya, and Sayed Yusuf, Mohammed tweets, referencing 2 other jailed Bahraini activists. Our next leads from New York, where the city council is supporting crowdsourcing to improve low-income neighborhoods. Using the online fundraising platform Kickstarter, residents are asked to donate funds for urban farms, new cafes, and art installations. New Yorkers like the idea. Anna Meyer tweets, "This is a great example of social media and city government coming together to make things happen." Lastly, from Ecuador, we're following reaction to the decision to grant asylum to WikiLeaks founder Julian Assange. This is crazy. Correa persecutes, insults, and imprisons journalists and the media in Ecuador, but he gives Assange asylum? Kat asks of the Ecuadorian president. Jay Sebastian is more optimistic. "I hope this government is consistent with the same courage that defends Assange internationally to defend freedom of expression here." Well, you can find more reaction to that story and others on our website at stream.aljazeera.com. Josh?
Thank you, Malika. Thank you, JJ, Elliot, Syed. And I'd also like to thank the stream team, Alice Hodari and Zach Alfred, who put up for me this week. Normally, I host a show called Fault Lines, and they let me come over and sit in the chair for a day. And that's about the fastest 45 minutes of my life hosting the stream. It was a great time. On Monday, the team looks at the upswing in attacks in U.S. mosque, and why almost no one outside the Muslim community seems to be talking about it. And until then, we'll see you online.